Good morning and welcome to RCCT Soul Talk with Father Jay.
Hello.
Today we are delving into the past a little bit, partially because when things are uncertain in the future, I think personally it helps to look towards the past to see how people may have handled similar situations, evolving situations in the past. And we're really fortunate because today I wanted to talk about a little bit about Vatican II.
Okay.
And the changes of Vatican II. And we're fortunate because we have a priest who in his childhood was pre-Vatican, and I think your entire priesthood took place.
Yes.
Well, what year was Vatican II specifically? I know it was 60 something.
It was like, what was it, 62 through 64, 65.
So was it was actually a period of time? How did it work? Because I think there's a lot of people who just like last week when we talked about Elijah, we throw out, Vatican II, Vatican II, Vatican II, but really we don't have a lot of church members who really remember before it or really know what it is other than just saying the term, since Vatican II.
Well, like all ecumenical councils, it was a gathering of the bishops from the entire world. And as is indicated by the name, at the Vatican. There were numerous councils in the past. The Council of Nicaea, where we get the Nicene Creed from, and we get the Council of Trent, where we get the reaction to the Reformation.
Mm-hmm.
We have several Lateran councils, which were also in Rome, but that's when the Pope lived in the Lateran palace.
Can I ask, and this is just for my own clarification, because ecumenical is another term that sometimes I think we throw around. What is ecumenical?
Well, basically it means worldwide.
Okay.
And so that's why I said the bishops from the entire world gathered in council together with the Pope. And, like with all big meetings like that, it was spread out over time because there were various sessions. And that was because, we don't want to keep the bishops away from their diocese for 2-3 years.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
We want them to go back, do their confirmations, etc., the things that a bishop has to do in his own diocese. So there were various sessions. There were also set up for committees that would work on some of the thoughts that were brought up in the council and some of the things that the Pope had set as the agenda. Pardon me. And other things that, popped up. And these committees would discuss them and come up with drafts of ideas, which then would be debated by the bishops, voted on by the bishops, changes added, things subtracted, Basically, in a lot of ways, like Congress would work if Congress worked.
And that's a fair enough point.
Which it doesn't seem to anymore. But at any rate, so there was discussion. And there were those who felt that the council went too far. Others who felt it didn't go far enough.
And do you think, really, would you say that you think that feeling still permeates today? Because I feel like sometimes when Vatican II is talked about, it can, amongst the priests, I don't think among the people so much, but I think among the priests it sometimes can be viewed as divisive.
Well, it is in the sense that the results of Vatican II became divisive.
Okay.
they became divisive because a lot of the things that were discussed at the Vatican Council and promulgated by the Council and approved by the Pope were left, in a certain sense, to still be worked out in actual function.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that's where the division comes, because it kind of would just break the church's belief and tradition that if you have an ecumenical council, its decrees are
Worldwide.
well, they're worldwide, but they're also infallible
Okay.
to a certain extent, at least, and they don't agree with it. One of the principal ones that came up was, and still divides to this day, is the liturgy, the Mass, because Vatican II updated it, or called for its updating. The liturgists went on and updated it afterwards, called for it to be updated, called for it to be in the vernacular. And
Because prior to this, just for anybody who may be younger or doesn't really know, it would have only been in Latin.
for the most part,
Okay.
there were some. I still would have been in Latin, but it wouldn't have been exactly the same, because there was the Ambrosian Rite in Ambrose was Bishop of Milan, so around there, but it was slightly different. But it would have been in Latin anyways, yeah. And some bishops even highly opposed the new Mass when it came out because of the decrees of the Council of Trent, which established the Tridentine Mass.
Which
Trent Tridentine.
And the Trent Council was actually way back in the
1500s.
As part of the Counter-Reformation, or the response to the Reformation.
Right. And so they felt, because in the council decreeing that, they decreed condemnation and excommunication if you varied from that formula.
So that had to particularly affect a lot of, how would you say, probably traditionalists.
Yes.
At the time, in a very, very negative way.
Right. And so you got the, what's it called? The Society St. Peter.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to remember all these names, but at any rate, we're taping this in the morning. And basically, they formed their own, almost separate church. There was a lot of back and forth and giving and taking, and that's why the Tridentine Mass has been allowed in the Latin Rite. So it's a kind of peace offering to bring unity back together on that issue. And there was kind of a, what do you want to say, a wild and free period, so to speak, after Vatican II, especially when it comes to the liturgy, because let's face it, for the most part, most of the members of the church face the church, receive the church, know the church through the liturgy, through Mass.
Yes.
And so that was the point that was really big.
It seems like the goal was actually quite noble in a lot of ways, I guess, of trying to bring people more into understanding.
It was, and it was also the fact that, you know, often, and I'll still hear it, people have gone to hear Mass.
Okay.
Not be a part of it, but to hear it. And that's pretty much the way it was with the Tridentine Mass. People didn't really know Latin that much anymore. I've heard recordings. I particularly have one. I have an LP of a mass, a memorial mass for President Kennedy, celebrated by Cardinal Cushing in Latin. I can't figure out what the devil he's saying.
Which is, so that's where I guess I want to go with this a little bit, is you grew up then right on it because you were born in 1950.
Yes.
So you were then a teenager during mostly a teenager
Right.
during the Second Vatican Council. And I'm assuming it took longer after the council for it to see any type of implementation.
It came slowly. I remember, the call for participation that came. And the call for participation came quietly in, okay, the congregation should say the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father.
They didn't before.
No.
Okay.
No. Everything basically was said by the priest, and the altar boys, and they were altar boys at that time, represent the congregation in responding.
Which is, so that brings it even to more to clarification what you mean when you said, I went to hear Mass.
Right.
Rather than
participate in it.
Yes.
And so, okay, participate, say the Our Father. But this was still when it was in Latin. So we learned how to say the Our Father, Pater Noster, qui es in celi, sanctificated,
so on.
Right. I can't remember beyond that anymore. It's been a long time since Latin.
Well, and I guess where I want to, pull this in, because I feel like we could go hours, but to, kind of bring this full circle, that had to have been a very trying time for the people.
It was a change.
For the priests, I assume, too.
Yes.
And I'm assuming that, because, you have different hierarchies of priests. You have, your bishops, then you have kind of the inner circle, you have the vicar for reigns, you have all of those.
Those are modern inventions.
Oh, really? After that.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm assuming you have a hierarchy who may have been more on board or tasked with implementing. And then you have the parish priests who really don't have any say. And I think that's something that sometimes, even today, we forget, because, I'll take what Father Mike sometimes says, because he says he doesn't like when somebody comes up to him and says, oh, we would solve all the problems if a priest could get married. Why don't you do that? Because it's not within a parish priest's purview, one way or the other, whether agree or disagree. It's interesting to see people assume you, as a parish priest, are supposed to change the world or change the entire Catholic Church. And I understand the frustration, and that's the person that you can usually talk to is your own priest. But I'm assuming that had to be really hard on parish priests, because there may have been so many people who were attached to the old way that they probably got mad and castigated them.
Well, I'll be honest in saying I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I was a high school student. I didn't have that kind of interaction. Pardon me. And then I went off to college when a lot of this stuff was still in the implementation stage. And, I lived in the dorm and whatnot at college. And, even though it was a Catholic college, it was not like a seminary. I wasn't in the seminary in college. So I didn't see a lot of that. I saw what the lay person saw And I think one of the first things, the most visible thing, aside from, okay, all of a sudden we're hearing, and it went slowly, suddenly certain parts of the Mass were in English.
Okay.
And then it all became English. But I think one of the most noticeable signs was the altar was turned around. The altar had been facing the wall, and the priest said Mass not facing the people, but facing the wall, or whatever was behind the altar.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And, at certain points, he would turn around and say, Dominus vobiscum, the Lord be with you. And then the altar service was by Acum Spiri Tutuo, and with your spirit.
Which is also why, talking of other church changes,
Yes.
because I remember, as we were growing up, it was, and also with you,
Right.
and I think it was 2011,
Around
Advent
then,
2011.
When we changed the, when we went again, we had this year where we had a sacramentary for the Mass and a lectionary for the readings.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden we had a Roman Missal. Going back to the Roman Missal, which was what was previously in the Latin Mass, except now this is in the various vernacular languages. So you had the Roman Missal with the things in English.
Then that was the second Roman Missal. And then they came with the third one where it went to the exact translations. I think that's what.
Well, again, it was a very difficult time because, again, there were people in Rome who have a thing about translations.
Mm-hmm.
Translations have to be word for word. Okay. The problem is that word for word translations do not always convey the meaning of the original language.
Mm-hmm.
We have idioms. There are idioms in Latin and there are idioms in English, but they don't carry over in translation. And so the insistence on word or word or word being exactly the same and order, because, sometimes I find the verbiage or the wordage to be confusing because usually in English, the verb in the sentence is close to the beginning of the sentence. In Latin, it's the last word in the sentence.
Which makes it sometimes harder. And the big one that I will always go to is consubstantial, which I've sung the Creed, and I've sung Mozart's Creed, I've sung Bach's Creed, I've sung the Creed so many times that I know the Latin is consubstantial, which is consubstantial. But in today's world, what does it mean?
Word that we use too often.
Of one and being with the, which is what it was.
What consubstantial means.
But that's not common. I would even go so far as to say it's not vernacular. Even though it is, you're taking the English word, but it's such a foreign concepted word.
I mean, we know in language words change. If you want to pray the Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Okay, we're using English, but it's not English that we normally use.
When's the last time you used the art? Where art
when
thou?
I do.
Yeah. But I think the thing is, though, where you go with it is the church survived. I mean, I would argue that had to be an incredibly tumultuous time because ecumenically, which we've now established as worldwide, there was a massive shift from Latin to vernacular, which is a huge If you think about that on a worldwide scale with the amount of Catholics in the world,
And language, all these different languages they speak.
that's a huge shift. But the church survived.
The church survived. It was like an earthquake in a certain sense, but it was meant to be. I mean, when St. John Paul the 23rd called the Vatican Council, he said it was to open the windows and let in fresh air,
Mm-hmm.
bring more life to the church, bring more understanding. And that's what the hope was. Well, again, you know, there's always an opposite side. People who feel no, everything is perfect the way it is. And I guess the only thing that basically I can say to that is change is inevitable
Mm-hmm.
and necessary. Change is necessary for any living organism to survive. It cannot remain the same forever. It just atrophies then.
Well, and in our own way, we've constantly talked, and it's constantly been said, the church is the living church. It's the church of yesterday, today, and forever. It is the living church. And the circumstances where people get frustrated on our current changes, and I think that's where, windingly I want to go with it, is our current changes are at least, I think, not as earth shattering. What's our biggest struggle right now? Yes, a decline in membership, but I will say RCCT. I have to check the new parishioner forms every week. We get 7 to 10 new parishioners registering at the 5 churches every week. We have more baptisms than I ever could have imagined. And I and Father Mike has said this too. The people seem to be coming back. That doesn't change, though, that we're struggling for priests.
Well, we are struggling.
And everywhere is struggling, I think, for priests.
Not everywhere.
Well, it's Southern Hemisphere, from what I've heard a lot of, particularly Africa.
Africa and Asia.
Really, I hadn't heard Asia yet, but
Well, I think because the church is such a small presence in Asia, but the number of vocations there is, in comparison to the number of Catholics here and elsewhere in the world, surprisingly high.
and that's something that we have to pray for, as Father Mike has said a lot of times. Encourage people whom you think might be good priests to consider it. But that's also, we have to deal with the hand that we're dealt today, rather than wishing for a different future. Or I guess if you don't move and you stay still and you're not trying to be proactive, there's not much that you can do.
Well, it's true. And, we've been hit with a stinging blow. A stinging blow in the clergy sex scandal, let's face it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was like, whoa, what's been going on? What's been going on? I mean, I could go on forever with that. But the whole point is, families are not really overly enthused about their sons becoming priests.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a profession that has become looked down upon in many ways, which is fine in one sense because it was held too high before, perhaps. It was held too high that we were like godlike figures and, all of that.
Which isn't right either.
You know, it's like a line that keeps on popping up in my head every now and then from the movie Saturday Night Fever. John Travolta is home for Sunday dinner, a typical Italian family. And in the dining room, above the head of the table, is this huge picture of his brother, the priest. His older brother, the priest. And he's one line remarks, you have to genuflect when you go by. And that was an old Italian mother. There's a priest. I have a priest in the family. Great pride, great status. Well, we've been knocked down a few pegs. Quite a few pegs. That's all right. We were up too high to begin with. So there's nothing the matter with that. But it does not help when we are, getting to that point.
Which you hate phrasing it this way, but recruitment.
Yes.
It doesn't do a great job.
No, it doesn't. And, we are lacking. We are dismal. And again, there's a lot of other societal factors that contribute to it. Celibacy is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
A lack of religiousness in society today, especially amongst young people. Now, they say they're spiritual, but not religious. And, we get that constant.
Well, I think what it is with young people is it's very hard to talk about, because being of the younger crowd, so much of life is focused on the tangible.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That it's very hard, and no one wants to appear foolish. Which I know, I appreciate the irony as we live in the day of where they'll post pictures of them doing stupid dances or something like that. But,
Yes, I do.
No one wants to buck the crowd in a lot of ways. And it feels very, even myself, up until COVID, talking about faith was something that I was like, oh, it's hard to do, because even my great-grandmother, who was a Methodist, who was a very devout woman, who went to church almost daily, whether just to be there or do something at her church. She cared about her church massively. She never once talked about faith. And that was, in my family, that was put on the pedestal. She didn't need to talk about it. She just lived it.
I think that's the point. It was part of the reality. But again, it's just been part of the slow societal change. And I mean that truly. And it's all, and the church is blamed on the Vatican Council, because the societal changes began appearing about the same time as the council. And, lack of respect for institutions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, correlation isn't causation. As tough as it is, that is the part where we're going to have to cut. But we want to thank everybody who came out to last night's praise and worship night.
It was wonderful.
It was a great crowd. Our next one's going to be at St. Christopher's. The date is still to be determined, but it will be at St. Christopher's. And if you haven't gotten your raffle tickets, we've had a great return on them. Please, please do. Those Dingus Day raffle tickets go to support the entire family. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And we will see you next week.
Bye. God bless.